I'm Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a series of conversations on issues of critical importance to America and to the world. Today, for the second week in a row, which is something of an unprecedented for this show, we'll be talking about Iran, which at least for the moment, the crisis atmosphere seems to have been diffused after a dozen or more tumultuous days, even by Middle East standards. And all of you should know by now that I am quite skeptical of transformations, particularly when they're applied to this region. The region has a way of grinding up big ideas, peacemaking, war making, all kinds of U.S. and other initiatives end up meeting regional realities. And I would say with great forthrightness that I'm willing to suspend my disbelief, borrowing a line from Samuel Taylor Coleridge, because events here are truly unprecedented. I also believe that even if we had the famed oracle at Delphi here, Pythia, reading the best of Godin trails, it'd be very difficult to plot out specifically how the three main actors in this drama, Israel, the U.S., and Iran, are going to evolve their strategies. But we're fortunate today to have two guests that actually might be able to do this. So let me briefly introduce them. General David Petraeus retired as a partner and chairman of KKR Global Institute, which he established in May 2013. Prior to founding KKR, Petraeus served for over 37 years in the U.S. military, culminating his career with 6 consecutive commands, 5 of which were in combat, and serving as the Director of Central Intelligence from 2011 to 2012. Kareem Sajapur, my inestimable colleague at Carnegie, is a senior fellow where he focuses on Iran and U.S. foreign policy toward the Middle East. I must say about Kareem, he has an extraordinary skill of being able to gain thematic altitude on one hand, but also this capacity to understand the granularity of what's taking place in the region, and bringing those two things together is actually quite rare for any analyst. I think we can all agree, and we did spend a lot of time last week talking about Israel, that the Israeli and U.S. strikes have set back the Iranian nuclear program. I don't want to argue BDA. We don't know precisely how much, and I'm going to ask General Petraeus in a minute about the process of BDA. At a minimum, I think it's fair to say that the combined Israeli and U.S. strikes and the Iranian reaction, which has not trended toward escalation, has bought us time. The question, in my mind, since military power is at best a means to accomplish a concrete set of attainable, realistic objectives, how are we going to use the time? And that's a critical question. But before we get to it, General Petraeus, can I turn to you? Yesterday, Rafael Grossi talked about, quote, severe but not total damage to Iran's nuclear infrastructure, and he added with a capacity of beginning enrichment within months. Without trying to delve into the details of what the U.S. and Israel has or have not accomplished, if you were still at CIA, what would you be telling your analysts to look for? And if there were a combined U.S. intel assessment, if there are differences, how does that usually play out behind the scenes, or if not public?
Well, first of all, the process of battle damage assessment is to bring in all of the potential elements of intelligence that you can possibly gather. Everything from cyber intelligence, signals intelligence, imagery intelligence, measurement and signals and mass intelligence, human intelligence, of course, if you have someone on the ground, and even open source intelligence, which is increasingly rich now because everyone is a journalist if they employ the social media that's available to them with their smartphone that, of course, has cameras and can take videos and all the rest of that. So the art of this is to bring all of that together. The science is to gather all of it and to exploit all of the sources and methods that can possibly provide you insights, and then to integrate it all, fuse it, and to come up with a community position. Now, you ask if there are disputes. There are disputes from time to time. One agency may see this as being having high confidence, another not as high confidence, et cetera. And that's all part of the process. And various agencies can dissent to various degrees. You can have a footnote, you can have an actual annex. I dissented one time in the national intelligence estimate that was conducted at the 6-month mark of the surge in Iraq. I said I just completely break with it. But to be fair to them, that's because they closed the books on the data 6 weeks before today, Mr. President. And those 6 weeks have seen a dramatic continuation of what we were just seeing before that time, which was a downturn in violence. So that's the process here. I'm sure that it is going on feverishly, everyone trying to collect everything they possibly can to try to draw on every source that is available. Noting again that the very best would actually be human eyeballs, perhaps even inside or looking down into the wreckage of some of these different sites. Esfahan, fairly straightforward. That's mostly above ground, not too deep. And Natanz, a good bit deeper. And of course, that's why they had to drill down further and further and further with the bombs dropped by the Israeli Air Force. And then we put 2 more of the massive ordnance penetrators into it. And then you have Fordo, which reportedly had 12, although we only see the holes for a smaller number than that, but still very substantial. But that, of course, is burrowing down very deep. And then the 30,000-pound projectile, precision munition, and then the 5,000 pounds of explosive in its nose explode, detonate. And so, of course, to truly assess that, you would have to get inside at some point in time. But I think with a fair degree of confidence that just about all the centrifuges in there will have been destroyed, at the very least by the concussion, and that the vials of highly enriched uranium, if they were there, will have experienced similar damage. Of course, the real question, and I think this is why the IAEA director has been a bit cautious in his assessment, is whether or not there are centrifuges elsewhere. Are they advanced centrifuges? And is there highly enriched uranium elsewhere? I would note, though, that, and not too many people have noted this, but Esfahan is critical to the start of the enrichment process. It actually takes uranium, puts it into a form that can be enriched. And then at the end of it, it actually turns it into the metal that is actually shaped to become the nuclear device. Without that, I'm not sure they might be able to enrich further if there is HEU and if there are centrifuges elsewhere, although they're going to have to put them together and so forth. And I seriously doubt that they can do that without the combined capabilities of Mossad, CIA, and all of the other intelligence agencies and organizations that will be party to this, discovering that that is going on.
Yeah. I want to stay with the BDA issue just one more minute on the issue of politicalization of the intelligence. I remember well during the early 80s, during Israel's invasion of Lebanon, the deployment of the Marines, INR took a much different position on the prospects for success in Lebanon. And I had 5 years at INR. We were sending assessments up to then Secretary Schultz, about which he was not very happy. They convened a special national intelligence estimate to try to coordinate an intel assessment, but they couldn't. And INR ended up taking a somewhat different position. Are you as worried as I am, and I'll lay it out very clearly, about the potential politicalization of intelligence now? It's not an academic matter. What the Iranians have, what they don't have, what we may not be aware of what they have, these are critically important issues because they may well determine military conflict. I'm just worried, having voted for Democrats and Republicans and worked for Democrats and Republicans, that the president's open dissing and dismissing of his director of national intelligence, his own battle damage assessment, which was put out within hours of the conclusion of the operation, and using the Israeli Atomic Energy Agency's assessment as his own, strikes me that there's the reality, and then there's the world as it is, and then there's the world the way you want it to be. Does this concern you at all going forward?
Well, first of all, we should recognize this is by no means unique to the current situation. If you look at what happened prior to the invasion of Iraq, there was a bit of more than a bit, really, of a predisposition that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction and the means to deliver them, et cetera. By the way, that was the predisposition of two. I was the executive, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs during the Clinton administration. It was an article of faith that actually did exist. In fact, we bombed it a couple of times. And the description was that we had degraded their means for delivery and the means for production. And that continued to be, in a sense, an article of faith. And there was a search for intelligence to justify that particular predisposition and the action that would result from that. The key here, really, though, Aaron, is just, and this is, I'm not worried about, is that our intelligence community professionals will speak truth to power. They're not, again, without mistakes at various times. Obviously, 9/11 was one of the most catastrophic of those. There are intelligence failures. There are surprises. The collapse of the Soviet Union was another. But they are doing their level best to provide their best assessment of the facts on the ground, what they mean, the analysis, finished intelligence, and so forth. And then, frankly, what the DNI or president or other consumers do with it is their matter. I think it's concerning if this is not put forward. By the way, I should note that when I was the director of the CIA, prior to assuming the position, President Obama sat me down. He said, especially when it comes to anything in the Middle East, Iraq, Afghanistan, and so forth, Greater Central Command area, I want to know your view as well as the view of the community, of the CIA integrated analytical product. And he said, it's okay if you actually see it somewhat differently. In fact, I would value that given all the time you spent out there in the past decade. But of course, obviously, what you do need to provide faithfully is their assessment, obviously, even as you might provide your assessment. So that's my take on this. I think the community should be very, very forthright. And by the way, if those above them don't like it, they may be seeking other employment, and they will do that. That has happened recently with the chairman and vice chairman of the National Intelligence Council.
Yeah. I mean, I am very wary, and I have a lot less respect, I think, for the amount of respect that the current administration has for the system, which is sometimes very often imperfect. But there is a degree of respect that I think is critically important to be shown on behalf of these public servants. General Petraeus, I'm going to use a concept that you've identified, but first turn to Kareem. And that is the so-called big ideas that inform and attach nations, militaries in combat, political administrations that direct their militaries to attain specific objectives. Kareem, looking back now and going forward, and even more importantly, what are the big ideas, tactics, strategies that inform the Islamic Republic at the moment, both with respect to their responses to Israel, as well as the additional challenge of responding to the United States? Big ideas.
Thank you so much, Aaron. It's great to be with you and my good friend, General Petraeus. And in fact, I learned that concept from General Petraeus, the big ideas and everything, when we are writing or speaking. And the big ideas of the Iranian Revolution haven't changed. It's hostility toward America, hostility toward Israel, to replace Israel with Palestine. And then internally, remaining highly conservative Islamic State, the symbol of that being the mandatory veiling of women. I'm reminded of the famous quote from Talleyrand after the Bourbons came back to power in France. He said they've learned nothing and they've forgotten nothing. And, that was evident in the Supreme Leader's speech of a few days ago, in which he essentially declared victory and congratulated his population and his government on this great victory. And so what we've seen is that Iran's capacity, as General Petraeus outlined, has been significantly degraded but its intent hasn't changed. And I think moving forward, their tactics may be a little bit different. So let me focus on a few different ideas. Number one, they've essentially paused the war with America and Israel so they can clean house internally. This is a regime at war with America, Israel, and its own people. And, they need to shore up their internal power, and they've been going after hundreds of people internally, calling them Mossad spies, threatening to execute them. And we know from history that they usually imprison innocent people and peg this on innocent people to make an example of them. Second, in the nuclear context, as we've seen from their foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, they will continue to express an openness in diplomacy. They're not going to slam the door on diplomacy. But what they're doing simultaneously is they're significantly limiting any type of cooperation with the IAEA. The Iranian parliament is essentially a rubber stamp institution. It's headed by Ghalibaf, who's a close acolyte of Khamenei's son, Mojtaba. So they don't act independently. And so when the Iranian parliament announces that the country, the government should leave the NPT, that's a top-down edict. These are signals being sent from the top. We know that it's been reported they haven't been returning any of the IAEA's calls. So it's this combination of, showing a willingness to continue to partake in diplomacy, but also significantly limiting the access of the IAEA. What are some of the other things that we've seen over the last week or two? There's been some concerning reports about their attempts to go after soft Jewish targets in Europe. This is something that they've done in the past. And, they have now pretty close ties with criminal elements in Europe through which they can do this, going after whether it's a bus full of Israeli tourists or Jewish tourists or religious outposts. That's something I would be on high alert for. Some senior clerics in Iran have issued a fatwa against President Trump, calling for his death. I think that's mostly symbolic. The last thing I'll say is the thing which is not the focus of our conversation today, Aaron, but something I'm worried about is that I think Iran is going to do everything in their power to sabotage Syria and Lebanon's attempts to transition to a post-Iran order. It's been reported in the last week that both those countries are potentially close to joining the Abraham Accords, to potential normalization with Israel. I'm not sure how accurate that is or how close they are, but certainly I think both countries, both leaderships in those countries, have sought to hope to change their relationships with Israel. And I think Iran will do everything in their power to sabotage any chances of that. Similar to how the Hamas attack on Israel October 7th was an attempt to sabotage Saudi-Israel normalization. And one of the things I would be concerned about, and we may have spoken about this before, is Iranian attempts to assassinate leaders like Ahmad Shara in Syria or the prime minister and president in Lebanon. So I'll stop there.
One point coming before I turn to General Petraeus on the issue of big ideas. You've made the point that the day after the revolution, the most extreme righteous revolutionary becomes a conservative, because conservation and preservation of regime stability, of endurance, the revolution itself, depends on a degree of tactical flexibility. And it seems to me, if we're right, that this is the most perilous moment for the Islamic Republic since, the Iran-Iraq War. Does that dynamic of regime stability, does it produce risk readiness? Or does it produce risk aversion? An 86-year-old guy deep in a bunker, many of his advisors no longer exist. What do you think?
So on Khamenei, we've talked about this before, Aaron, that the big idea for him is an observation which Machiavelli and Tocqueville have also made that the most dangerous moment for any bad government is when you try to reform. So Khamenei has consistently learned over the years that the autocrats who take a step back and promise reform, whether that was the Shah in 1978 or Gorbachev's attempts to reform the Soviet Union, or even if you look at the Arab Spring countries, those autocrats were not long for this world. And so he's committed to those ideals of the revolution. And that's why he calls himself, and they call themselves principalists, because they say they're committed to the principles of the revolution. So as long as he is around, those principles, hostility toward America and Israel and the Islamic nature of the system, are not going to change. But as you pointed out very importantly, this is a government which wants to stay in power. He's arguably the longest serving autocrat in the world, and you don't get that title if you're a reckless gambler. So at moments when he feels the existence of the regime is at stake, he's willing to make a tactical compromise. And that's what we saw with the JCPOA in 2015. The only thing I'd say right now is that the one way in which I believe the regime doesn't feel its existence as at stake is the level of economic pressure. They are at the moment exporting about 1.7 million barrels per day, approximately, probably smuggling out a little bit more than that. The Trump administration in his first term got those numbers down to around 300,000 barrels per day, significantly less. And it's my view that if the goal is to set the table for another negotiation with Iran in which we're trying to not only extract concessions from them on the nuclear file, but also potentially, and we can talk about this, on missiles or proxies, there needs to be a strategy to significantly curtail their oil exports. And that's not, I know the president has a sense of impatience about this, but that's not a switch you can turn on and off. That's right. A process which takes many months, and it's not currently there.
Right. General Petraeus, to you, we can talk about big ideas on the Israeli side, but first to the Americans. What's at the other end of the calculations in Washington on this strike? What were they trying to achieve, and what will they try to achieve going forward?
Well, I think, first of all, you should understand the domestic context in which this is all playing out, because, of course, there's a war weariness in both parties, a bit more surprisingly in the Republican Party, to be sure, with the America First movement coming back to the fore. But I think President Trump very conscious of that. Members of Congress also very conscious of this. And so an effort by the U.S. to clearly circumscribe what it is that we were doing, to assure Americans that this was not going to be, if you will, quote, another Iraq or another Afghanistan or another Vietnam, which was the watchword prior to that. So I think that's very important to recognize. There was a keen awareness, of course, that Israel could not take down Fordo. That's always been a huge limit on. They do not have the massive ordnance penetrator, the 30,000-pound precision munition, nor do they have a plane that can carry it. And it's not as easy as just giving them a B-2 and a MOP and saying, go employ it. You have to actually train for this very considerably as well. So that recognition, which has always been there. I remember Ehud Barak, who was then the Minister of Defense of Israel, also under Prime Minister Netanyahu, a different coalition to be sure, when he was, and I was the CI director and he was the Minister of Defense, coming in essence, they wanted to do the operation all the way back then, but they were keenly aware that they didn't have the means to deal with Fordo, the most important, the most advanced enrichment site even then. And so they were always trying to get us into this. So this has been, again, a point of real key recognition on the U.S. side with Central Command, with the Israelis, and always with each administration of either party. And in this case, with Israel having achieved surprise, having achieved such very impressive results, air supremacy is quite an extraordinary accomplishment, given that Iran had a supposedly sophisticated Russian S-300 air and ballistic missile defense system, some of which was degraded in the Israeli response to the second Iranian attack from their soil on Israel. And then a lot of it finished off during this. So at the end of the day, there were limits to what Israel could achieve. There may have been some kind of diabolically clever plan to go on the ground and do something that's always been held out there, but far, far better, frankly, for the U.S. to use its unique capabilities with the massive ordnance penetrators and to use them in real number, as was the case here. And a very impressive operation indeed by the U.S. I should note that when I was the Central Command commander, Fordo was released publicly, or revealed publicly to the public by the IAEA in the fall of 2009. And it was at that moment that we actually developed and actually rehearsed one time inside the United States the plan to destroy the entire nuclear program, as well as take down the air and ballistic missile defenses and all of the retaliatory means that we could get as well. So this is very much, even the Israeli and U.S. operations together were still somewhat of a subset of that even more inclusive effort. But in this case, again, having assured the population that this is going to be a one and done, at least for now, I think everyone has been really quite relieved even that this was not going to end up with an effort at regime change, the results of which are always certain. And frankly, from those regime change operations that we conducted, those that took place during the Arab Spring, there were relatively few outcomes that we would have hoped for.
Right.
So that's, I think, the domestic situation. That's how it was approached, it appears, by the administration. But we also should recognize that in this context is a very different big idea on the Israeli side about how they define border security. It's obviously much more expansive, much farther reaching. In the wake of October 7, they have clearly decided they will not allow any threat to materialize, to be developed on their borders. And of course, it's part of the genesis of taking on Hezbollah the way that they did. Obviously, Hamas was necessary as well. Also, some of the activities that Iran was carrying out inside Syria before Syria was the murderous Bashar al-Assad regime, an ally to Iran, was overthrown. A very significant development when it comes to Iran trying to reconstitute Hezbollah in particular, and then to go after Iran itself. So it's not just in the immediate neighboring countries, but those that can reach Israel and that have the kind of malign ideas that Kareem described earlier.
Well, let me ask you again to stay with the Americans for a moment. You could argue that the objectives of the American strike could have been one of three. Number one, to change Iran's calculation on the severe costs that would have been required to maintain their program. That's number one. Number two, essentially to force Iran to recognize the costs of a program outweigh the benefits by light years. Number two, to compel Iran, given the fact that it's weak and vulnerable, courtesy of the Israelis, to soften their position, to take a more realistic position in negotiations. Or third, as we've discussed at the opening, to buy time. So since military power is in fact a means to an end, I'm trying to sort through now exactly what the administration plans to do to capitalize on this extraordinary success and riding the tiger of Israeli operational brilliance with respect to Iran. That question is critically important the day after, or shall I say, the days after question. It seems to me there are three alternatives: negotiation, performative or productive. I defer to Kareem on this. That's one. Number two, resume military actions. And I cannot imagine the Israelis will sort of forego their preemptive preventative approach, given what they see. Or third, some sort of slog in between war, that is to say regional war, and peace, that is to say an effective an agreement. If there are another set of objectives, how does that fit into the Trump administration's big idea when it comes to making this a success over time? That's maybe we can't answer.
First of all, I don't think any of us are absolutely certain of if there is a precise conclusion at this moment in time. Certainly there is a desire for negotiations. I think that is the right approach to take. The question is whether there could be a negotiation that is essentially compelled by this extraordinary amount of success by Israel, supported by the United States, or not. Israel is in an incredibly strong position. Maybe that they need to replenish their interceptors to be ensured that the missile math always continues to work in their favor. But beyond that, again, they can fly anywhere at any time and do anything over Iran. And that is an extraordinary achievement, air supremacy. So they can employ that when necessary. And the U.S. needs to be keenly aware of that and arguably should use that. Iran is in the weakest position it has been in at least since the first supreme leader drank from the poison chalice to bring an end to the Iran-Iraq war. And they've watched their proxies be heavily degraded as well. Their position in the region is dramatically reduced. And this is the time to either in a negotiation to reach Iranian agreement to do away with, dismantle its entire nuclear program. And if they need a civilian nuclear power program, we can provide them the low-enriched uranium for that. And it's a time to allow the IAEA to oversee the dismantlement of this program and to be able to inspect anywhere at any time to validate and verify that. The question is whether we'll be willing to use the position of strength that has been achieved by the Israelis and the Americans in this particular case. And then, frankly, if the Iranians, who can be quite obtuse at times, would be willing to accept that, or if it will mean that Israel will have to once again take advantage of its air supremacy to finish off whatever it is that emerges that is still intact, and perhaps to continue to do that as is required. I think that is the way it should go forward. There should be inducements to Iran, certainly. I mean, we should never give up hope that at some point Iran could give up its status as a revolutionary state that is not satisfied with the status quo and perhaps become more of a status quo state, recognizing how ruinous their policies have been for them and also for their people.
Right. I mean, we're guessing here, but you initiated a discussion on the role of domestic politics in this, and I think it is central. I think it's critical. It seems to me that given the risk aversion on the part of the administration for any sort of mission creep, a slide into something that could involve the deployment, I can't see the circumstances, of American forces, maybe to take out undeclared but recently discovered nuclear sites, which can't be done from the air. If Karim is right, that negotiating with an 86-year-old Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei, who has no intention of displaying weakness in the face of this grand humiliation, that would suggest to me, if the fight is going to be over Iran's demand, obsession, compulsion with the need to enrich uranium on its own soil, and the administration's position is, particularly in the wake of these victories, zero enrichment, you're not going to have a productive negotiation. So that leaves, it seems to me, where the Middle East is always seems to be left. Neither here nor there, black or white, no transformations, just transactions. And it could coincide with, I think, something Karim feels very strongly about, which is no war, no peace, which, am I correct in assuming that would be the Supreme Leader's preferred outcome, Karim?
So I think what I like about General Petraeus' remarks is I think it's very important to approach these negotiations with a very clear idea in our heads about what our goal is, what our end game is. And I'm not sure that certainly in President Trump's head, there's a clear sense of, what is it that we're hoping to achieve? Obviously, the U.S. is let's say Iran is in a much weaker position than it was 3 weeks ago. And it's my view that, rather than simply limit the discussions to the nuclear file, we should talk about our other sources of great concern with Iran. And one of them is the regional context. And I think in the regional context, there's issues you can open up, which also our partners who have decent relations with Iran feel very strongly about. And one of them is the issue of sovereignty. If you talk to GCC countries, they will speak with one voice about their demand that Iran respect regional sovereignty. That's an issue which the Chinese historically have also felt strongly about. So I think it's very valuable to approach Iran with these concrete demands. And as we've talked about, Aaron, you're much more successful when against Iran when they feel like they're facing a united diplomatic front, that there's no space in between America and Europe, the US and GCC, or even on some of these issues, the US and China. Now, if we rewind to 2013, the run-up to first the JPOA and then the JCPOA, what we saw from the Supreme Leader was total defiance. He didn't give any indication whatsoever that he was going to prepare to compromise. But what President Obama essentially did was he checkmated them economically. He made it clear that nations and businesses around the world had a very clear choice. Either you can do business with America or you could do business with Iran. And for most countries and companies around the world, that was a clear choice. But that process took a while. But that was what led to the Supreme Leader's famous speech calling for heroic flexibility. So right. I think that this time around, it's worthwhile having these very tough demands from Iran, not just in the nuclear context, but also in the weapons context, the regional context. But that process, in my view, they're not going to agree to unconditional surrender next week or even next month. I think that that's a process which plays out the more we tighten the economic grip on their ability to export oil.
I mean, I had a pretty low confidence that negotiations were going to succeed during 5 rounds, but that confidence was lack of confidence was deepened when the president imposed a 2-month deadline for those negotiations to take place. In fact, he boxed himself in because there's no way Iran was going to concede within 2 months. I'm searching against my better judgment in my own analysis for clarity, and there really is no clarity. And that, I think, is a disturbing but sober assessment. So let me raise the subject of regime change. This is a terrible regime. It prosecutes, tortures, imprisons its own citizens. It tries to spread its revolutionary ideology in at least 5 Arab capitals. It's pursuing a nuclear weapon. It's not India. It's not Pakistan. It's pursuing a nuclear weapon, perhaps as a hedge or in the service of its ideological objectives. Should there be a change in Washington's position with respect to regime change, an effort to support the opposition forces, any number? There are 1,000 papers written about this. The bottom line seems to be, I think they're probably right that strategy is going nowhere. But first to you, General Petraeus, what do you think?
Well, I think we have to be very, very cautious about the situation. There is no organized opposition. If you become a successful organizer, a charismatic leader, you're going to end up in jail, if not killed. And there's no large armed opposition. Normally, if a regime is so weakened that it can be overthrown, the group that is on the top of the hill when it's all said and done is that which has the best leader, both in terms of knowledge of how to go about this, charisma, inspiration, and then a large armed force. And the guys with the most guns, far and away, are within the regime. So the idea that, yes, 80% of the population may hate the regime, may resent what it's doing to them economically and politically, culturally, and all the rest of that, but you just don't see the kind of force that is there that could overthrow And again, if the people really come out again, we'll see the Basij militia really come out again. That the final element, if you will, if after the Revolutionary Guards Corps and Quds Force and its Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, not to mention the regular forces, if they're required. But the Basij militia, 2 million-ish, if necessary, that'll swing pipes and, if necessary, even shoot at their own population. Yeah. And there doesn't appear to be the kind of crack there. Now, not saying that it would be visible to us in all cases, but the idea that it would come from the outside, I just find very unlikely. Yeah. We should recognize that there are ethnic and sectarian groupings in the Islamic Republic that might want a degree of autonomy or even independence, or to merge with their kindred spirits, their brothers, if you will. So the Kurds, who are contiguous to the Kurdish regional government of Iraq, the Turks, the Baluchis, contiguous with the Baluchi province of Pakistan, the Azeris, Arabs, etc. That's different, though, from overthrowing the regime. And I don't think that is likely either. In fact, as soon as the dust began settling, the regime forces began reasserting themselves, especially in the areas of these minority ethnic and sectarian groupings. So who would you support? I mean, we didn't support the Syrian opposition before it had extremists in it, when it had a real possibility of actually overthrowing the minority regime government of Bashar al-Assad. So how we would do that here, I just find a bit elusive.
Yeah, I would only point out, you brought up Ahmed Shar's government. It's stunning to me. For years, working almost 25, we tried to persuade Assad that in the event the Israelis were willing to concede the entire Golan, which Rabin and Barak were willing. In exchange for that, Assad would not authorize direct contacts between senior Israeli officials and Syrian officials. And now, with Israel in possession of the Golan, I would argue probably in perpetuity, you have reports, credible reports, of Israeli-Syrian negotiations, direct and facilitated by third parties. It's really, with a former Al-Qaeda affiliate, Ahmed Shara. It's really quite remarkable. Karine, I'll give you the last word on regime change.
Thank you. I agree with everything the general said. Let me just conclude with a couple broad thoughts. One on Washington and one on Tehran. In Washington, if we look at Reagan's Cold War strategy, which was successful, there was three broad elements to it. There was an arms control element to it. There was the element of supporting our allies against Soviet expansionism. But there was also a very important element of supporting the cause of freedom and dissidents and the information war. And that is, in my view, something that's been lacking in the current context. And in fact, in the last 4 or 5 months, a lot of these institutions that played an important role during the Cold War, like the National Endowment for Democracy, Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, those institutions have been gutted. Now, I think all of those institutions needed, especially Voice of America, significant reform, and they need to be modernized. But I think it was a gift to the Iranian regime to simply gut these institutions, because they were institutions that the leadership in Iran very much was concerned about. And in fact, all these years, Ayatollah Khamenei has believed that America's strategy for destabilizing the Islamic Republic is not hard power. It's American soft power. So, final point about dynamics, internal dynamics inside Iran. General Petraeus put it well. I do believe that this is a politically mature society in Iran. It is ripe for representative, accountable government. I think that, whereas if we read about popular protests, anti-government protests in places like Saudi Arabia or Jordan or elsewhere, that would be a cause of concern for most American officials. But when you hear about them in Iran, that's a cause for hope, that it would be an improvement on the status quo. But leadership is so critical, both inspirational leaders and organizational leaders. And, at the moment, that demand for representative government and demand for change inside Iran, there's not a supply of leadership to take people to where they want to go. So I think more likely, Aaron, what happens is that everyone is really waiting for Khamenei to leave the scene. Age 86, people are really waiting for that. And in many ways, I think that the Islamic Republic is going to face a similar fork in the road that both the Soviet Union and China faced in the mid-1970s, which is, do you want to double down on revolutionary ideology, or do you want to put the economic and national interests first? And, I could lay out both those possibilities for you in Iran, that, Khamenei dies and is replaced either by his son or another revolutionary leader who just continues to double down on this ruinous ideology, which has not led the country to anything but, economic malaise and isolation. But, there's the other possibility of what I would call kind of a Deng Xiaoping figure, someone who has the credentials of a first-generation revolutionary figure, but says, 2025 is a different world than 1979. And if we want the system to survive, we need to put the national interest first. And so I think, right now that is probably something which a lot of people inside the country are hoping for, given how impervious the regime has proven to both reform and collapse. Perhaps it can be a process from within, and it remains to be seen.
I would only conclude by saying that if you want a new Middle East, if you want to do transformation, not just transaction, you're going to need leaders, not just in Iran, but everywhere. Leaders who are masters of their politics, not prisoners of their ideologies, and leaders who are willing to risk. And unfortunately, we have a dearth of those leaders today as I look around the region. But I want to thank both of you really for an informed and very rich discussion. Time, I guess, isn't an ally or an adversary here. It's just a reality. Thank you both, General Petraeus.
Great to be with you, Aaron. Thank you. And great to be with you,
General. Likewise. Thank you, guys.